It's a pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the first Fantasy Frontbench Debate. I'm Sarah Chater. I'm Director of Research Strategy and Policy at UCL. And I also oversee UCL Public Policy, which is our institutional initiative to build engagement between academics and policymakers. This evening marks the official launch of the partnership between UCL Public Policy and between Fantasy Frontbench, which, as you all probably know by now, is a non-profit digital democracy service. And I'm really delighted to be working in partnership with them. We hope this will be the first in a regular series of debates and other events. I just wanted to reflect briefly. Much of the work of UCL Public Policy focuses on building awareness of policy processes and on creating opportunities for academic policy engagement. And that's really important. But so is the role that universities have, I think, in not just generating knowledge, but in convening knowledge and in facilitating and stimulating public dialogue around some of the crucial policy challenges that we are all aware of. To that end, it's really important that we can create broader awareness of politics and the political processes that underpin public policy making. Fantasy Frontbench, I think, offers a really simple and engaging way of doing that. And I particularly welcome its focus on increasing the awareness and participation of young people in politics. And it's a delight to see so many students from local schools and colleges here tonight. I think supporting our younger generations to become aware and politically active engaged is one of the best investments we can make in the future of our country. So I wanted finally to say thank you very much to Helen Czerski, our chair, to Sadia Sajid, her co-chair, to our panellists, Natalie Bennett. I was trying to do you in alphabetical order. Mark Maslin, Ahir Shah, Emily Shuckburgh, and I think I succeeded. And also to Catherine Welsh, to Matt Seren-Smith, and all the Fantasy Frontbench volunteers who have worked so hard to make this event happen. Absolutely, finally, bit of housekeeping. There are no fire drills, so if the alarm goes, the exits are here at the front. Please keep your mobile phones on silent, but do tweet. I'm going to hand over to Helen now, and there'll be a few minutes, 1 minute of silence before we begin the broadcast. Thanks very much, and I'm really looking forward to the debate.
Hello, I'm going to borrow a microphone here because although we have much technology at the front, it's not all working. Now, the first thing for me to do is to say hello to the people who are watching the live stream on YouTube and Facebook. There are lots of us in the room, but we're not the only ones listening in on this, and it's a great thing. It allows the debate to carry on and to be seen more widely. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about what's going to happen. We have this question to debate. This evening on the topic of climate change and climate policy. And we want to have a debate. This is not about sitting here and just agreeing, and so we've got a range of different opinions to hear. So what's going to happen is that each of our panellists is going to spend 2 minutes laying out some of their views on the topic in question. We've had submitted audience questions, so we will have a debate around those questions. Now, for that bit, the people in the room won't be able to participate, but you will get your chance. So after we've had that debate and some closing statements, the live stream will finish 1 hour from now, just less than 1 hour from now. And at that time, we'll lose our live audience, but we will move into a Q&A with the people here in the room. So if you've got questions and comments, hold on to them for that last bit. And that will be recorded, and snippets of that will be available online with the rest of the debate. So you still get to join in, just not in live time, just because of logistical issues and as being quite limited in time. I should introduce our panellists. We have Dr. Emily Shuckburgh, who does lots of things at the British Antarctic Survey. You may well have seen her on the news and talking about lots of things, but she also is the deputy head of the Polar Oceans team there at BAS. We've got Professor Mark Maslin, who's here at UCL, works in Earth System Science and the Anthropocene, and is the director of one of our big PhD student programs here. We've got Natalie Bennett, who is a former leader of the Green Party and a very vocal and passionate voice on a lot of issues around climate change. And finally, on the end there, we've got Ahir Shah, who's a comedian, providing a slightly different perspective, but a very valuable one. And he was the 20s. I'm serious about that, because these are all issues that get debated in many ways, and we need many perspectives. And he's even a prize-nominated comedian at the 2017 Edinburgh Comedy Awards. So, and also beside me here is Sadia Sajid, and she is the youth member of Parliament, or was a youth member of Parliament for Newham, and she'll be helping helping me chair the event. So we've got lots of people up the front here. So to begin, the question we are debating is, should climate change be the UK's major policy priority? And we're going to hear, first of all, from each of our panellists. They're going to be timed by Sadia. Oh, and I should have said, there's this live polling thing going on behind us. So the question is going to remain there. If you're in the room, you should have a little clicker. You can vote as the debate's going on. You're allowed to change your mind. There you go. So have a play with it.
Hey, fun.
And we will be watching that as time goes on. So if you've got opinions, if you hear someone that says something, you change your mind, show us what you're thinking. Shift the debate a little bit the other way, and Sadia will be keeping us up to date with what's happening on that. Okay, has everyone had their little play? You've all had a little play. You're a positive lot, 2/3 yes. Okay, right, so we are going to start with, let's start with Natalie, I think. 2 minutes. Should the climate change be the UK's major policy priority?
Okay, I'm going to start with a shock. Not what you expect me to say. I'm going to say, if you want a yes-no answer to that question, I'm going to say no. Which is not what you were expecting. Because if we think about the state of our natural world, our environment, Blue Planet 2 has finally got people thinking about the fact we've turned our oceans into a plastic soup. We've choked our planet with plastic. My first degree was agricultural science. I can get really geeky about the soils and how we're trashing our soils. And I won't do that to you tonight, but it's a huge issue. We have the majority of the planet facing water stress. We have a whole range of environmental crises. And then we've got social crises. We have the fact that one of the biggest growth industries in Britain is food banks. We have many millions of people unable to put food on the table, keep a roof over their head. So what I would say to you is that climate change is one of the crucial policy issues. It's an essential one, but we cannot just pick one major one. Now, those of you who are sitting down near the front will be able to see I'm wearing a little multicoloured badge. That's the badge for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that replaced the Millennium Development Goals. And they cover the economic, the social, and the environmental. And my thesis is that we need to look in that holistic systems analysis kind of way, and we need our policies to cater essentially to climate change, but to a whole range of other social and economic issues as well. So I'm not expecting a big march going down Whitehall, going, what do we want? Systems thinking, when do we want it now? But actually we have to have systems thinking at which climate change is absolutely at the heart. But as Dieselgate showed, we can't just focus on one issue because we can mess a whole lot of other things up at the same time.
Thank you, Natalie. Next up, I think we'll have Emily.
So I'm a climate scientist, as we said in the introduction, and I thought in these opening statements it might be useful if I kept my science hat on before we got dragged into the politics. So science obviously can't tell you what should be a policy priority, but it can tell you reasons why you might want to care about climate change, why you might want to be concerned about it, and why you think that action may be urgent. And so I wanted to go through 5 reasons that I think are important based on our scientific understanding. So the first thing is that the current levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere are unprecedented throughout all of human history, prehistory and beyond. To find comparable levels of carbon dioxide, you have to go back to a period 3 to 5 million years ago. Second reason, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, so as you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, temperature goes up, and we've seen about a 1 degree increase in temperature over the last 150 years. But for people, the thing that matters most is not the average temperature, it's the extremes. High temperatures, high humidity can prove deadly for vulnerable people, particularly elderly people, and it's now estimated that today 30%, almost a third of the global population is exposed to such deadly conditions each year. There are now numerous cases where we have looked at extreme weather events, whether it's heat waves or flooding, and been able to say that the amount of climate change we've already seen to date has meant that the risk of those extreme events has significantly increased. The third reason, coral reefs are a good example of something where climate disruption is already causing significant damage. Coral reefs are not just exposed to warming temperatures of the seas, but also to the acidification that results from increased carbon dioxide emissions. Our oceans are acidifying at as fast a rate as we saw 250 million years ago when the greatest mass extinction on Earth occurred. So even carbon dioxide levels that are consistent with the Paris Agreement pose an existential threat to the coral reefs of the world. Fourth reason, am I over
2
time?
minutes, yeah.
Well, very quickly, fourth reason, we know that dramatic and rapid changes in climate have occurred in the past, and we're concerned about that they might occur in the future, particularly the ice sheets of the world, which would lead to dramatic sea level rise. And the fourth reason would be that in terms of our carbon budget, the amount of carbon emissions that we can make to stay within 2 degrees temperature rise at our current rate of emissions, we've only got about 20 to 30 years left before that budget is exhausted.
Okay, right, next we'll have Ahir.
Hello. As was accurately pointed out on this topic, I am definitely the dumbest person of the four. But it's, people like having a comedian on these sorts of things because I think it's always useful to lend a certain amount of levity to the apocalypse. I would say that while it should be one of our major policy priorities, I don't know whether it should be the top policy priority. I think that it vastly overstates both the power and role that this country now has in the world, particularly at a time where we seem to be willfully abnegating most of our power and responsibility on a wider stage and retreating into ourselves. I feel as though this is the sort of issue that would only be in any way satisfactorily dealt with in a vastly multilateral way, and consequently has to be higher policy priorities for those who can actually do anything about it in a cumulative way. So, for example, the European Union, also the United States and China and India. I think it's also interesting when you think about what our country can do compared to the rest of the world. Two of the largest things that have probably stopped anthropogenic climate change being far worse than it is the fact that China has a one-child policy and the vast majority of Indians don't eat cows. And it sort of puts into perspective how much we can actually... and still... also, I mean, our politics has for a long time suffered a prioritization of the short term over the long term. I don't necessarily think that the answer is just to flip that entirely. But what is nice to think is that lots of our other policy priorities can nicely dovetail with a focus on helping the climate over time, right? So we've got a massive housing crisis in this situation. What a great opportunity to have more sustainable housing in the future. When we're thinking about the future of transport, we can think about the electrification of the railways and cars. Where is that electricity going to come from? You think about the next generation of electricity generation, right, which also dovetails in with the skilled jobs of the future. So I think that nation states will always have sort of multifarious policy priorities, and we're not going to be any different, but what we can at least do is pursue those myriad goals in such a way as to ameliorate climate change. Go with that.
We also give you credit for using the most long words of anyone yet. So let's see if the professor can beat you, and that is not a challenge. Please don't. Go on, Mark, what have you got to say?
Okay, so back to the apocalypse. So if you think about it, climate change is actually one of the 4 major challenges of this century. And this is why I'm going to agree with Natalie, because we have environmental degradation, we have global inequality, and we have global security, all of which dovetail with climate change as the issues of this century. So let's just take environmental degradation. Before the Industrial Revolution, there were 6 trillion trees on the planet. There are now 3 trillion trees. If we just take the weight of mammals on the land, you know, David Attenborough going out into the wild, okay? 30% of the weight is you lot, humans. 67% is our livestock and our pets. And the stuff that David's looking at is 3%. That's how much we've changed the landscape. So, global inequality. 6 million children die needlessly every year. 600 million people go to bed feeling hungry every night. Let's not even talk about whether they actually get nutrition. That's just lack of calories. And 1 billion people still do not have access to clean, safe water. Oh, and by the way, 8 billionaires own the same amount as the bottom 3.5 billion people. Welcome to the brave new world. Global security, I'll leave that to Trump. Right, moving on. So should I worry about climate in 20, 40 or 100 years' time? Problem is, if you're government, you have multiple priorities. Bizarrely enough, this one's obsessed with Brexit, immigration, cutting welfare, destroying the NHS, but there are real issues in this country. So, for example, the government's own stats say that 4.1 million children in this country live in poverty. That's 30% of our children in the 5th largest economy in the world. 21% of the UK's wealth is owned by the top 1%. That was only 10% in 1980. So, do I think climate change should be the government's top priority? No. I actually think the government should make the UK a sustainable, green, low-carbon economy which generates wealth and well-being for all. This can be easily done by changing priorities and ensuring there are win-win solutions for every sector of our diverse society.
Okay, so we see the lie of the land. We're going to, during this next bit, encourage our panellists to debate with each other. And how are we doing on our little thing here? Oh, it's shifted, hasn't it? It's shifted the other way. Good, right. We like you changing your minds.
That's what's currently known in this country as the overwhelming will of the people.
Okay, so we've got some questions that were submitted by the audience beforehand, and we're going to start with one from David Shires. And the question is, what do you think the policy landscape would look like if climate change was the top priority? Who would like to have a go at that first? Go on.
So what's really interesting about the United Kingdom is, firstly, we actually have a law about climate change, the Climate Change Act, which mandates the government has to cut levels of emissions by 80% by 2050. So that's the first thing. The other interesting thing is the previous government, over 15 years, started to stuff climate change into every part of government. This current government is having great difficulty unpicking it all. So the interesting thing is, if you want to include climate change, you need to actually include it in every single decision. Whether you choose to actually put new roads, whether you build new airports, how you actually build houses, all of that has to have that underlying policy looking at, well, is that good for the people? Does that generate wealth? Does that actually deal with sustainability? Does that deal with climate change? And if you can tick all 4 boxes, then of course you should go ahead.
Anyone else? Yeah, Natalie.
Well, I think we at the moment, we have a government that thinks about dealing with climate change as a cost. Oh, and we can't afford that, just like we can't afford to give disabled people benefits or ensure that children don't go hungry. And we have a government that, I've got a notebook here which has got a sticker on it, Save the Pont Valley. If we were thinking about climate change, we would not be about to start a new open-cut coal mine in County Durham. Yes, I didn't make that up. We are, unless the protesters manage to stop it. We would actually be investing in active transport, encouraging walking and cycling. Now, if you're here in central London, it doesn't look terribly bad, but I can assure you around the rest of the country, this looks like a positive forest of cyclists. And walking in lots of parts of the country just to get around your own village is really difficult. And we have a government that says, oh, we can't afford to do these things. We can't afford to invest in renewable energy. But what they're ignoring are what's known in the jargon as the co-benefits. If we went for renewable energy, community-owned renewable energy, we'd have money going, recycling back into local communities. We would be protecting the wonderful wild meadow in the Pont Valley, which is going to be destroyed for that coal mine, if it goes ahead. We would be investing in home energy efficiency, having a warm, comfortable, affordable to heat home for everybody. We've got a huge problem with fuel poverty because of the poor quality of our housing stock, not because of the cost. And if we invested in active transport, we'd actually cut the cost of the NHS in the best possible way, because people would be healthier. So we would have, if we had a government that was serious about climate change, would also be a government that would get that this isn't a cost, This is a way of changing our society away from trashing our planet and making life miserable to stopping trashing our planet and creating a better society, a better life for people as well.
Thank you. So maybe climate change is just the quick route to everything else. Emily, perhaps could you add something about the range of ways in which climate change impacts lives of people? You know, we hear about the polar ice caps. You and I both work at the poles, but we live here in Britain, right? Could you perhaps say a little bit about the different ways that climate change might matter, or anything else on the policy landscape you'd like to talk about?
Well, I can, yes, if you like. So in the UK, I guess, you know, we've all seen in recent years significant episodes of flooding in the UK, and so probably it comes as no surprise that the biggest future risk for the UK specifically comes from flooding. But there are other ways in which climate change can impact the UK that are perhaps less obvious. So in terms of our food supply, so much of our food supply comes from around the world, that actually climate change that's not necessarily happening here in the UK, but it's happening elsewhere in the world, can impact us in the UK as well. And then, as you were just alluded to, Helen, there's significant concern about the polar ice caps. I work at the British Antarctic Survey, and just this week we launched a big research campaign to go to the Thwaites Glacier, which is a glacier that's part of the West Antarctic ice sheet. We are very concerned that the West Antarctic ice sheet is showing signs of being in irreversible retreat, and if that ice sheet collapsed, then it would eventually lead to some 3 meters of sea level rise, which would transform global coastlines. There are low-lying parts of the UK that simply wouldn't exist, East Anglia, where I live, for example, at that amount of sea level rise. And long before you saw that full extent of sea level rise, then a combination of much less sea level rise together with heavy rainfall events, for example, would lead to large areas being, well, essentially uninhabitable. So there are really great concerns that are deeply rooted in the scientific evidence.
Okay, and Ahir on the end there.
So I think on the question of what the policy landscape would look like if climate change was a top priority, I think that part of the issue at the moment is that the negative externalities of various things that drive up carbon levels and stuff are not priced into the cost of people actually doing them. So, for example, something like fuel duty, which has been frozen for successive budgets for, I don't know, you'll know how many years in a row, has happened. That would not happen anymore, and it would become more expensive to drive, for example, and we would start nudging people towards living in more sustainable ways. I think it's also worth pointing out that one of the really large consequences of this on a global scale will be the sheer quantity of climate refugees that are going to be created through the increase in natural disasters that will occur worldwide, and will quite probably result in far more people who look like me trying to come to this country in coming decades. So if any of you have any connections to the Conservative Home Office, just tell them that is going to be happening, and they will immediately get on the policy as quickly as possible, because as the fear of a brown planet is very real among those guys. But also, I think as loath as I am to admit as uncomfortable it is for my team or whatever it is to admit that certain things are going well, I think that there's also the fact that recently we've seen the first days with which we've just not used any coal since the Industrial Revolution in this country, and it is also worth pointing out that certain things in our policy landscape are already being done, and also, like, you know, even taking away certain subsidies isn't going to change the fact that solar power is getting dramatically cheaper and wind power is getting dramatically cheaper, and it's not going to return profitability to coal. So there are some bright spots.
Okay, so so the thing with all of this in dealing with policy, and this is something that is very common in policy debates, is that it all comes down to the details. Things sound great in theory, but in practice, what are you actually going to do? And there's a question here from James Lees, which is, if climate change was the UK's national policy priority, what would we do about aviation and shipping? Because those are sticky questions. Anyone got some comments on aviation and shipping?
Actually, I have one comment on aviation in particular, not least because academics are terrible. Our carbon footprint from flying around to world conferences is pretty disastrous. But I think that certainly within my own area, I have seen an absolute sea change in the last year in terms of video conferencing. So I think that a very large number of meetings that we do for business travel, this is not for personal travel, but for business travel, could be eliminated very quickly with the advances in video conferencing. Obviously, there are some meetings you have to do face-to-face, but an awful lot could be dramatically reduced. So I now have a policy in the projects that, research projects that I manage, that we always offer the ability for people to video conference in. I think you could make a huge difference.
And it's a lot cheaper. I mean, that's actually why it's happening, I think.
It's not just academics. It's not.
There is the will, but there's also it's a lot cheaper.
I've got 2 kids, so childcare is a nightmare if I travel off to conferences. So it's come back to the co-benefits thing. Actually, there's all sorts of co-benefits of some of these things.
Mark.
Sometimes it's also about incentivizing. So the reason why shipping has been so problematic is because the owners of the ships hire the ships out to the people to move goods. So it doesn't matter if they're inefficient, it doesn't matter how much the fuel costs, because the owners don't bear that cost, and so they don't renew their fleet, they don't actually keep care of their ships, and it's actually the people moving the goods that pay the duty. And so the Carbon War Room has been looking at how do you change legislation, how do you change international regulations to ensure that it's the owners who actually have that cost, because strangely enough, when you shift costs and business realizes it's going to cost a lot to have a really inefficient fleet, or it's going to cost a lot to actually keep it in sort of fossil fuels, then innovation works. And so it's really weird. So in the policy landscape, you just need to shift who pays, and suddenly change will come.
Ahir, have you got anything about shipping and aviation?
One of the weird things that I heard about shipping is that now, like, we've melted so much of the stuff, on a map, like the top, right?
You're a geographer by any chance?
Yeah. So we've melted so much of that we're going to start being able to go around the top to ship stuff, and people are like, oh, isn't this great, we're going to cut thousands of miles off the route, and it's like, yeah, only by having done like ludicrous levels of damage already, and it's like very distressing. Natalie, I don't know whether this was a Green Party proposal or something that I heard elsewhere, but there was something that someone said about on the aviation front that there would be like a tax escalator based on the number of flights that you took per year, and that might be a way of disincentivizing.
Oh, you've just given her a perfect policy plan.
Well, this wasn't actually a Green Party proposal, but it was a proposal by a range of NGOs that we backed. Because one of the things that people often, attack us over is they say, how could you rob this poor family who's, working 3 jobs and 0 hours contracts and thoroughly miserable, in midwinter from somewhere up in the far north, how could you rob them of their week in the sun? But the idea is that if you fly once a year, the tax stays fairly low. If you fly twice a year, it gets more expensive. If you fly 5 times a year, it gets more expensive. Now, of course, it's worth saying that 50% of people in Britain don't fly each year. And of course, those are proportionately poorer people most of the time. But nonetheless, if you put the tax on for the people who are actually doing the damage, if you're flying to your holiday home in the south of France every weekend, then we want to price you out of doing that. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But I think what it's also worth stressing when we're talking about this is I'm not really concerned about individual behaviour. And in fact, I know that people often fly or often take the car instead of the train because they simply can't afford to take the train. Flying to Paris is very nearly torture if you compare it to catching the Eurostar. But lots of people still do it because they can't afford to take the Eurostar. So we're back to the issue of system change. And as you said, Ahir, the question of the real cost being the price that's on the ticket. And we need to make it so that the environmentally friendly and the socially responsible choice is the easiest, cheapest thing to do. When we've done that, then we're getting towards a society that's dealing with climate change and dealing with all the other issues we were talking about earlier.
I have to say, it just reminded me of something that I was horrified recently to learn that there's a group of people who fly just to keep their air miles up and will fly to Honolulu and back without basically getting out of the airport just to keep enough air miles to keep their flight status. And I haven't felt physically sick while listening to the radio for quite a long time. Anyway, Mark.
So I was going to add that 2 years ago, the EU tried to do something really exciting with flights. What you may not know is 60% of all global flights go through European airspace. So what they said was, right, okay, so we're going to make you part of the carbon trading scheme within the EU, which exists, unless you have one in your own country, which nobody else does. So that's fine. So, however, they were putting this in, except, of course, strangely enough, the USA and China objected because how dare they actually impose a fine or a levy on international travel. So the interesting thing is that Europeanness and that idea that you can influence the whole globe by taxing within our area was then challenged globally.
There's lots to get into there, but we're not going to. We're going to move on to a different aspect of the policy world. And it's an interesting question, especially at the moment. It comes from the Hampstead School, who I think are here. Are you here, Hampstead School? Yay, Hampstead School at the back there. Right. So the question is, should an increasing focus be put on technological fixes for climate change? What do we think about those? Go on, Emily.
Want me to comment? So technological fixes. There are basically two ways you can sort of start to think about technological fixes. You can either find ways of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, or you can find ways of trying to reflect some of the sunlight. Those are the two essential categories of what's sometimes called geoengineering. And so there's a lot of research to look into both of them as potential plan Bs. As plan Bs, they have lots of issues and complications associated with them. So probably the least radical, if you like, is trying to find ways of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And in fact, pretty much any scenario that sees us keeping to the temperature limits that were agreed in Paris basically relies on some form of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the latter half of this century. So we sort of need that technology at least on some level. But some of the issues that are around that are, for example, issues around competition for land use. With respect to, if the simplest thing would be just to grow more trees, but you can't cover the entire planet with trees because you need to leave space to grow crops, for example, for feeding people. There are issues in terms of water usage. So you have to, there's not a simple solution in terms of any of those geoengineering things. And another key concern is that if you start doing that, you start disrupting weather patterns. And so you might create some weird weather, disrupt the monsoon, for example, in one part of the world. And then how do you get into, there's all sorts of complicated legal issues and liability issues around that as well.
And the legalities are fascinating because fundamentally, the atmosphere and the oceans, they don't care about national boundaries, to the disgust of many politicians, I think. Ahir, what do you think about technological fixes? Does that appeal to you?
Well, I think there are a few different things that you can mean by technological fixes, right? Like in some sense, a wind turbine and a solar panel is in some sense a technological fix, right? If you think that one of the largest drivers of the increase in global emissions is the vastly and rapidly increasing human population, then greater and better access to contraceptives is a technological way of getting around it in some sense. But I'm very skeptical about larger things such as geoengineering and stuff like that, just because it gets to a situation of we'll fix it down the line, like someone will come up with something very clever to suck all the carbon out of the air with a vacuum cleaner, and that doesn't mean that I need to actually do anything in the present, which strikes me as a bit irresponsible or something. But also, like the ultimate consequences of these things, or the unintended consequences. I mean, like think about Facebook was set up so that Harvard students could check if other people had boyfriends and girlfriends, and has now destroyed Western democracy, right? And so it's like, I don't know where the tech fix gets us 20 years down the line.
Right, technological fixes, Natalie.
Well, I think it's actually been very well covered already. I mean, I think the Emily on geoengineering rightly highlighted on the facts of the complexity of the world. One of the things that fascinates me is that we don't even understand the complexity of the human body. We've just started to recognise that there are more microbial cells in our body than there are human cells. And we're just dimly beginning to understand how complex the impacts they are on the way our minds work, the ways our bodies work. We need to understand how little we know. And in terms of technological fixes, I very much agree with Ahir. It's what do you mean by technological? Yesterday I was actually in Suffolk on a wonderful farm practising agroecology. Now, Emily said that we can't cover the planet with trees, and that's right. But there's a farm which is basically at least 30% more productive by planting rows of trees at roughly 12-metre intervals or rows of hedges at 12-metre intervals. Over on one side, off the farm, there's great expanses of rapeseed flowering now, yellow flowers. You go out and catch a train through the countryside, you'll think, oh, isn't nature lovely, isn't it wonderful? That's an unproductive biological desert we're creating. You look at this agroforestry farm, it's vastly more productive. That's a technological solution. But I think, again, Ahir's right that we have to think about, we can't just say this will fix things with technology. There's a very old green saying, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And Tim Jackson, author of The Excellent Prosperity Without Growth, demonstrated that you can reduce the intensity of GDP growth, carbon emissions from GDP growth, but you cannot decouple the two. We can't just keep going as we are and fix it with a bit of technology. We have to fundamentally change. And hopefully you're getting the idea that actually that's really good news, because at the moment we're trashing the planet and creating a miserable society. That change, the need for change, is a really good thing.
Natalie, I mean, you say that you can't have infinite growth based on finite things, but I'm reading a history of the world up till now. I've only got to the first bit of the 21st century now, but people did a lot of very complex stuff with mortgage-based securities based on a finite number of houses, which delivered an extraordinary amount of growth for a while. And I think that probably, I haven't got past 2008 in the book, but I think it...
Don't worry, I think the audience already has.
Yes, yeah. There is a saying in Polynesia where they paddle canoes and you have to get on with everyone in your canoe, that a canoe is an island and an island is a canoe. And the idea is that on a finite, the smaller the thing you're all floating along on, the more you have to cooperate. And I think the global citizenship is meeting that idea. Right, we've got another question from Sophia Jorgensen, going back to the policy world, which is that what's the impact of the Paris Climate Agreement on energy policies, for example, in the UK? Has anything changed? And what happens next? Because we're all very excited about the Paris Agreement, right? Was it worth it?
Putting myself out of this one.
Okay, I think everyone's looking at me at this point. I can feel everyone looking at me. Well, I think it's first of all worth saying that it was tremendously important. You know, I was in Paris and we got something much better out of Paris than had been expected. Of course, not as much as we hoped, but positive things. If we look at what's happening around the world, however, it's only one part of the story. I'm going to refer to you, Ahir's story, in terms of you're saying, you know, how great it is that solar and wind is getting cheaper so fast. So in many ways, what's driving policy change, what's driving change on the ground, is actually those practical realities as much as the Paris Accord. But I think Emily was referring to the fact, you know, we've got something like 30, maybe 50 years, depending on how fast we cut, of carbon emissions left before we have to get to net zero. There has to be a global cap, and it has to be shared out fairly. Now, the Green Party, we've always very much believed in local decision making, but we have to make decisions also at the right level. And so we do have to make sure that we have global agreements, and we need to make sure that governments stick to those agreements. And that means, first of all, we need to start with our government sticking to its agreements and following through on its promises.
Can I add something, actually? So the other thing that I think was really important about the Paris Agreement was that in Paris, it wasn't just national governments that were involved. There were a lot of non-state actors, as they were called. There were people from cities, people from regions, people from business, people from civil society groups, all got together. And I think one of the key things that's happened post-Paris is that those different groups, including and especially in the business world actually, are really taking forward their own agendas on climate change. And so we've seen just in the last 18 months a huge sea change, I would say, in the business world. Now surveys of global CEOs say that some 1/3 of global CEOs are now extremely concerned that climate change will affect their organisation's growth prospects. So it's suddenly become a mainstream issue for corporates to worry about, and there have been various different policy interventions that are specific to businesses that are helping drive that forwards. Now, that being, the Paris framework, Paris Agreement setting a framework at a governmental level that then is allowing other groups to take forward the agenda, I think has been an incredibly important and powerful thing, and that will help give it longevity.
Mark, was Paris enough?
No. So reality check. So Paris was fantastic. The French did a brilliant job of diplomacy. Great. But it's not enough. So even if they can stick to a 2-degree target, let me give you the reality check. That means we have to drop our carbon global emissions by 3% every year from 2020 until it hits 0 in 2070. Then what the scientists don't actually tell you is that after it's got to 0, we then have to have 30 years of negative emissions to suck out CO2 to guarantee that we keep to that 2 degrees.
I just did tell you.
But Paris doesn't actually get anywhere near that. And so again, the thing is, it's great. Politicians cheer, and then the scientists are looking at them going, no, this is reality. Negative emissions for 30 years. I can't even imagine a world where we get to 0 global emissions. So how do you actually then get negative ones is a huge debate.
So Ahir's giant vacuum cleaner is looking like it might be.
I mean, if that's what they're going to call it, then maybe I'm up for it.
You heard it first here, folks. Now, let's not forget about our poll thing behind here. Is everyone up to date on their polling issue? Because I'm about to try and shunt it. Yeah. Well, overwhelming agreement here. Right. So there's another question here, and I'd like one quite short answer from each of you, because following on from what Mark has just said, Lucine Hansen said, asked the question, what is one major threat, the major threat to the UK posed by climate change? You have to pick one. It can't be all of the world's problems. Who's going to go first?
Okay, I'll do an unusual one. I think that climate change, we can look at it through the doom and gloom lens, and I can do plenty of that from the science, as I've already given some. But you can also look at it through an optimistic lens. So, the science tells us, as we've been articulating, that very rapid transition is required to move towards a low carbon green economy, and that's going to create winners and losers, right? So one of the big threats to the UK is that we're not on the winning side of that transition, and in order to be on the winning side of that transition, then we really need to be prioritising investment in research and development around some of the technologies that are going to lead that transition in terms of the green growth agenda that the government is currently trying to push forward with its industrial strategy. There are real opportunities, but there's also the opportunity of not being on the winning side of that.
So maybe the technological fix that's going to save us all is fear of missing out, for anyone who's into that acronym. Right, who else got a threat? Natalie?
I was going to say global insecurity, war, famine, etc., but actually I'm going to focus it down a little, which is to say a huge threat to the UK is food security. There is enough food in the world now to feed everybody. As Mark said, more than 600 million people regularly go to bed hungry. That's not because there's not enough food. It's because there's too much inequality. But as the world population grows, and as we see farmland affected by all sorts of negative factors and soil destruction, I'm not going to get geeky about soils, I promise. But we, at the moment, only provide about 60% of our own food. We need to grow much more of our own food. We need to grow it in a changing climate. We need to grow it far differently. And we need an entirely different distribution, not the supermarkets. So we've got huge challenges in food security, not just the obvious threat of the climate changing and more difficult to grow food, but we've got to change our entire food production system in the UK for the era of climate change.
Ahir, what's your view on the greatest threat?
I think it's going to be very damaging for this country. The realization that there are some problems that cannot be solved exclusively through the medium of sovereignty will cause...
Everyone say it like that from now on, by the way. I think we should have that. In the
I think that will cause a substantial percentage of our population's heads to explode, which is a major issue. I mean, obviously, the food security and global security stuff are like the correct answers, so I had to think of something dumb.
So what was your major threat? People's heads exploding.
Yeah, people's heads exploding because they can't handle the idea that something might have to be done in a way that involves cooperation with other people outside of an island.
That sounds pretty serious. Okay. Mark?
I'm going to pick up on that. The interesting thing is that climate change challenges the neoliberal economic model that we've been suffering under since the 1980s. Because neoliberalism says, actually, governments don't know what to do, they shouldn't interfere, policy should be reduced, regulation should be reduced, and it should all be about business and industry because they're the most efficient at doing things. However, climate change says, no, I'm sorry, this is a global effect, it's affecting 7.5 billion people, we need to deal with it collectively, and we have to work as a team world. It then changes. So the challenge here is in the 21st century, how do we actually throw out the major economic theory for the last 30 years without losing all the bonuses that we've had from competition, capitalism, and things like that? And so that, for me, is the economic challenge of the 21st century.
So just before Natalie speaks, I will point out that somewhere in the middle of that, we hit 50-50. And you're not allowed to leave here until we've made a decision. So, Natalie.
We're not leaving.
Well, I just want to add to the positive feelings here because Mark said we have to get rid of neoliberalism, and the good news is we're in the last zombie days of neoliberalism. We've had 40 days of neoliberal, neo-Thatcherite thought. It's clearly failed even in its own terms. We're heading into a new era where we have to have a different sort of politics. So again, it's the right time, the right place, the right people to do it.
Anyone else got any other threats that they didn't get to say first time around? No, enough. We scared everyone enough. All right. So, I think what I'm going to ask you to do now, each of you. So we've got a few minutes left before we lose the live feed. I would like to mention again that there is a Twitter hashtag over there, and the Twitter will be involved more in the debate after we finish the live feed and while we're having Q&A. So if you have things to tweet, do them now. If you're in the room, keep voting. So for our last little summary from everyone, could you each, we'll go back to the question of should climate change be the UK's major policy priority? Perhaps a little bit from each of you, maybe answering the points of some of the others, sort of not just making your own point, but responding to some of the other ideas. And really, what do we do? Who's going to go first?
Do you want me to go first, if no one else is volunteering? So as a climate scientist, I started off at the beginning saying, I work in and around the polar regions, and I've seen, with my own eyes through my own research, the scale of the changes that are occurring, and I have a sense of the scale of the changes that could occur in the future if we don't address climate change. And that leaves me very concerned. I've got 2 young children, and they'll be in their 80s, hopefully, at the end of this century. And decisions that we make today are going to mean that they either live through a world that's been, rather similar to the world that many of us have enjoyed living through, or they'll live through a really, really radically different world. And that worries me. But in terms of UK policy, we do live in a democracy, and I was at a meeting last week in Cambridge where somebody said, but surely everyone in the country thinks that climate change is important now. But everyone in the country doesn't. It comes back to the bubbles that we've heard so much of in recent times. If you do national opinion polls, there was one done this time last year, only under 2/3 of the British population agree with the statement that climate change is happening and mainly caused by human activities. And when there's that level of disconnect between what is scientific fact and what is public opinion, then I think we have a real challenge for democracy. So I think that there is a real need for leadership on this, from our, including from our political leaders, to bring the population with us in terms of responding to climate change.
Natalie, what's your final statement?
Okay, well, you asked us to interact, so I'm going to disagree with Emily on several grounds, I'm afraid. First of all, disagree that Britain is a democracy. In the last election, 68% of votes didn't count. We have an unelected House of Lords. We're not a democracy in Britain. And I also think that the fact that about 2/3 of Britons understand the seriousness and the reality of climate change, given our right-wing media and given some of our politicians, is a real testament to the sense of the public, given the messages they've been hearing for many years. And I also think that I entirely understand why Emily, as a scientist, and other scientists in this room looking at the state of the world, can't help and have to talk about how bad things are. I think the practical reality of the practical politics is that we know, when I first got involved in green politics more than a decade ago, we were accused of, and there was some truth in the claim that you're going around wagging your finger at people and saying you've got to change your ways, or the polar bears are going to die and you're going to die too. And we know that's not a great way for getting people to change and do things and work together. What does work is saying, what we're doing now is not working. Rates of mental ill health among young people have skyrocketed. People are living in insecurity and fear, and we're trashing the planet. Changing those things together, going away from 3-planet living like we have in Britain to a 1-planet living that meets people's needs with security, offer people hope. Hope is a far better politics than fear.
Yep, give her an applause. Okay, how hopeful are you feeling, Ahir?
I'm feeling relatively hopeful. I think between us in this room, we've basically sorted it. And now we can look forward to the glorious future where we will all die as we should as a result of antibiotic-resistant microbes.
No, we're ending factory farming, so we've solved that one too.
Okay, right. Yes, I think it's undeniable. I think everyone in this room is in agreement that this is a thing that exists, is man-made, and is a very important thing to be dealing with. I think most sort of illuminating points were when Emily was talking about the global carbon budget and how close we are to blowing it just as a planet, and that it is really running out. So that's why I think, on a multilateral scale, I think absolutely this should be one of humanity's top priorities. Whether that necessarily translates into being the principal policy priority of the UK government is a different matter, and that's where I fall on the side of no for the specific motion, which I do realise was phrased in this way just to provide that level of dissent among a room of people who would otherwise entirely agree with one another.
All right, so Mark, you've got a minute.
Okay, so I'm very hopeful because we're humans. So give you an example, after the Second World War, the powers that won actually then had spent 5 years planning how to actually change the world. They came out in the second part of the 20th century with International Monetary Fund, World Bank, United Nations, and all the bits to actually fix the world. And if you think about it, we doubled the world population, we were able to feed them, and we got to the 21st century without another major world war. Okay. What we need to do now is then look at world governance and local governance and say, that worked for 60 years, it's not working now. We need new governance models because we're an inventive species to move it forward. I had the pleasure of interviewing Al Gore last year, and he said something really, really profound, which is not usual, which was, we need to fix democracy before we fix climate. So I'm with Natalie here. We have to fix democracy. We have to have democracy for the people to actually look after the people, and not the big money, fossil fuel subsidies, and companies that spend money everywhere.
And that is an excellent finish for a policy debate, because this is about policy. Now we have to finish there because we're about to lose our live audience. So let's finish. Let's thank our panelists for the...